All right, should be recording. I'll go ahead and welcome everyone to this author talk, the first of this academic year in our Performance and Stardom SIG series. This event is also co-sponsored by the Latinx Caucus. And today, Niamh Thornton is going to be talking about Maria Felix with some questions from Olivia Cosentino. We will have more events coming up in the spring semester. We'll have a talk with Justin Rollins and a talk with Barry King. And we'll also have our first roundtable on February 6th, and that will be about performance and stardom in the Indian context. So we're trying to cover a lot of diverse ground this year and help us all kind of be more informed and well-rounded scholars. So with that, I'll turn it over to Olivia to introduce Niamh.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda, for your work in organizing this. Truly, it's an honor to be here with Niamh. I wanted to share a brief anecdote because it relates to SCMS. 10 years ago, I was a first-year master's student, and I cold emailed Niamh to be on my panel, my very first SCMS panel, and she kindly accepted. And so we've known each other now for 10 years, and she's been just a really nice constant in my life and a mentor and role model in many ways. So I'm grateful to be here and excited that I get to introduce her and ask a few questions about this wonderful book. So Niamh Thornton is a professor in Latin American Studies at the University of Liverpool. She specializes in Mexican and Latino film, literature, and culture. This book, Maria Felix, is her fourth monograph. She also wrote Women in the War Story in Mexico, Revolution and Rebellion in Mexican Cinema, and Tastemakers and Tastemaking, Mexico and Curated Screen Violence. But her work has truly ranged very widely from Mexican women's filmmaking to conflict, violence, trauma, and in Mexican cinema, women in the Mexican Revolution, Chicano studies in the international sense, streaming platforms, and the creation of digital online selves. And I think perhaps what I admire most about Niamh is that she does not follow trends in the field, but rather I think she determines trends. I see her as a thinker in the forefront. And so two examples of which, I mean, one we're talking about today, but she was one of the very first in our field to bring together written scholarship and videographic criticism. So her book on Taste and Tastemakers, Mexican Screen Violence was also accompanied by audiovisual essays, one of which was chosen as BFI's best video essays in 2020, which is amazing. But she was also one of the earliest to write about sort of the digital world in media and Latin American media. So looking at Latin American streaming, a really excellent article, Bridges and Streams and Dams. And then back as early as 2010, writing about YouTube, transnational fandom, and Mexican divas, Maria Felix and Dolores Del Rio, which she continued thinking about as YouTube as archive later on. But her work is so wide-ranging that I'm really excited that this is where we've reached, particularly because I do star studies myself, and this is just such an excellent piece to dialogue with in my own work. So a brief introduction to the book. This was published in 2023 by Tamesis. I don't know how to say it. Sorry, Tamesis.
Yeah, that's how you say Thomas. Yeah.
And Maria Felix, for those who don't know, is such an icon in Mexico. This scholarly work is really long overdue. Niamh's work is not a biography, as she notes very clearly. There are biographies that already exist on Maria Felix, but this is really the first scholarly work of a monograph size on Maria Felix. But why I'm so glad we're talking about this today is that it really aims at a general academic audience. Niamh does an amazing job of explaining everything in the Mexican context. So I see it as being highly useful both to the field of star studies, but also making major interventions in Mexican film and cultural studies. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Niamh to give us an overview of Maria Felix, and then we'll come back for some more questions between us. Niamh?
Well, thank you very much. That's a very flattering and very heartfelt and very beautiful presentation. I'm very touched by all that, and it was a very good first meeting, and it has been a great kind of collegial, I think, and kind of really good friendly relationship since, and it's really great. And I'm delighted to be here. So thank you, Olivia, first of all, that, but also thank you, Amanda, for organizing this, and to Aaron for his original invitation, as well as, of course, all of you people who have come here to spend whatever time of the day this is for you um, listening to this. So this isn't a picture of a photograph of Maria Felix. It's a photograph of a tribute star, La Roña, and I'll get to that character shortly. So, sorry, get this to work properly. So this is an image of Maria Felix in her older age, but so the Mexican film star Maria Felix, she was a superstar in her lifetime across the Americas, France, Italy, and Spain. And those who know of her have strong opinions and stories of their own to share. I've had many and varied conversations with individuals about what she means to them, and it's often accompanied with an anecdote about an iconic moment, a legendary appearance, such as this one on TV, or a salacious piece of gossip. The wealth of material and the specificity of opinions, it's indicative of what Jamie Barron has described as archival noise. And in order to understand her fully, I had to kind of meander my way through this and sift through this noise, because she could be found in many different places. On film, in a range of iconic roles, in press clippings, as the cover feature of magazines, through her own biography and autobiography, in ephemera, in a legendary live television special, and in multitude of fan works. And my book considers the process of exploring Felix's legacy through the archive of remediated and transformed versions, and considers how these sometimes competing approaches to a star challenge us to rethink our archive and legacy. And of course, I'm indebted to scholars in the US, Mexico, and Europe who have researched popular culture with the seriousness it deserves, as well as the work of cultural institutions, creatives, and thinkers who've curated Felix, thereby facilitating my research. So I've broken the book is broken down in 5 chapters. I'm just going to give you kind of some images, screenshots, and other images from each one of these, just to give a sense of sampling of exactly what I engage with. So this is from her first major breakout role, which was called, the film was called Doña Barra. It was an adaptation of a book by the same name. And thereafter, she was nicknamed La Doña. And this figure in this film and book, for those of you who know, will know that it was a kind of very fearsome figure. So it established her as a very kind of dominant presence and a very physical actor as well. And in that, I wrote a little bit about actually her wardrobe, how that helped form her and helped kind of created a sort of a masked feminine sort of selfhood that then she carried, or persona that she carried throughout a lot of her other roles. I also then looked at the idea of gesture, and particularly kind of the micro gesture of her brow arch, which is really iconic. And this one image of her brows is an image that's been largely reproduced frequently to kind of as a synecdoche of Mexican film of this particular moment. But she was also very much involved in slapstick comedy. And this was often mixed with melodrama in very interesting ways. So I kind of look at that kind of maybe macro gesture as well. And then chapter 3, I was really interested in the idea of finding a way of talking about her, because in films that are lesser studied, because there are certain films by auteurs that have been considerably studied, particularly those directed by Emilio Fernandez. Whereas there's a huge range of other films she's been in that have been kind of overlooked. So I was looking for something and found a lot of people kind of mentioning the femme fatale, but it actually doesn't work for Mexican film as well as it does for Hollywood film. And instead, the idea of mujer sin alma, or the woman without a soul, is one that kind of really matches her roles. And I tracked that through a variety of different films that were made in Mexico, Argentina, and also Morocco, Spain, Italy, and France. And these are really varied, and there's really interesting kind of collaborative work that happened between the director, the scriptwriter, who sometimes were in conflict with each other ideologically, and what Maria Felix brought to these roles. Then moving on from her star appearances, I was very interested in her as inspiration. She's often referred to as a muse, but actually that really belittles what she was. And I was very interested in more looking at actually what does it mean for somebody who's actually very extremely wealthy at certain points in her life, um, and what she spent her money on. And some of this was jewelry, such as what you see here, and some of these are really expensive pieces, such as this Cartier piece, which actually really determined the jewelry history and really shifted actually taste and skills, craftsmanship as a result of her decision to buy these things and to ask for these pieces to be made. And then also I tracked what she was sold after she died through Christie's. And you can see all of the different paintings and artistry that she was also a benefactor of. I particularly highlighted those that were actually paintings or portraits of her because it was easiest to pick out. But she also she was a collector of many other pieces of art by artists who were not that well known but were living in exile in Mexico, and it determined her as a very much a kind of curator of and kind of central to um, the art world in Mexico at the time, which was full of exiles. And then chapter 5, I look at kind of the idea of fandom. So this is actually goes from very famous fans, such as the very significant or very well-known writer in Mexico, Carlos Fuentes, who wrote essentially a fanfic drama play about her and another major star, Dolores del Rio. And the first performance of this in Mexico City, if you can kind of take a look at the sort of makeup and the sort of, to a degree, maybe you can kind of pick up from the pose, because these are two men performing these roles when that's part of the play. That this drag artist, La Roña, the one I mentioned, who's used in the cover picture, then picked up and adapted and used for his performance of La Roña, which is kind of a very significant figure in Mexico. So it was that sort of maybe professional art or professional fan art, if you like, that I looked at, but also from the professional kind of singer performer who also dressed up as Maria Felix, to also these beauty transformations. Some of you might be familiar with makeup transformations. So all of these different younger people who were influenced by Maria Felix. And this is just up to 2019, which is where I stopped at the book, or at least I stopped with her in 2021. But in terms of the amateur ones, but you can still find people who will be influenced by and do transformation videos of her now, which is just a really interesting way of tracing her significance and meaning, and how these individuals, because that's part of the makeup transformation, is saying this person means this to me right now because. So it's a really kind of fascinating way of tracing a star's life through fan interpretations in these very specific embodied sort of forms. So I'll stop there and pass over to questions again. And maybe actually stop sharing. So
Thank you, Niamh. So it seems to me, and I think you said something in the book about how long you had been thinking about this project or working on this project, but it seems like this is something that has been built over a long period of time. So first, a few sort of intersecting questions. When did you first encounter Maria Felix? At what point did you begin working on this project? And how has your vision changed of her over the time, or sort of your understanding of her changed? Or has it?
yeah, it's quite a lot actually. So it has been a really long time. It's been, more than 10 years, been several decades actually, really it feels. So because I was with my first book, and when I went first to research the war story and the Mexican Revolution, encountered all of these films that she starred in, and she was a very potent figure in. And some of the earlier things some of the films that were set during the Revolution, so during the 1910 to 20, approximately, were the years of the Revolution, and during a lot of those films she starred in, or at least the ones that I found most fascinating, where she was this really interesting figure where she would cross dress and lead men into battle. And these weren't written about at all because, despite the fact that actually it seemed like something that actually at that particular moment would have been kind of quite interesting to a lot of academics who were kind of thinking about those kind of questions of transgressing kind of gender boundaries and kind of identities and that sort of thing. Um, and and it was kind of there was a knowing playfulness always in these films around that, because she was always known at like she was such a big star, so she was always Maria Felix playing this cross-dressing role. So and she was always glamorous, and then also characters in the films would go, "Oh my God, but you're a woman." There would be some reveal at some point. Um, so it was kind of that kind of interesting sort of. At the same time, I was writing about women who were transgressing in that in literature and kind of thinking, well, neither of these things have been written about, and why has that happened? So that's kind of the first germ of it. So in kind of working out one in the literature end of things, I sort of started kind of trying to work that out then, and kind of what does this figure mean? Who is she? What's she about? And finding that actually there was relatively little written. So except for about these small number of kind of quite nationalist films that really kind of told a very neat story of um, Mexican kind of that sort of formative moment in Mexican history. Um, that nonetheless are interesting and absolutely worthwhile looking at. So I don't want nationalists to seem like an entirely pejorative term or phrase or whatever, but they really did have nicher narratives than the other ones. So they hadn't been really looked at as much. So that's kind of my first thing. And then I kind of encountered, and you did mention the one on YouTube, is I started I was very interested in a parallel kind of way in digital cultures. And I was looking at sort of, well, what is there online about her? If the scholars haven't written about her, what are people online doing? And they were doing really interesting kind of readings of her work through all sorts of different, ways that people can do that, either through mashups or memes or through, those kind of large mixes or, collections or, because you can find, for example, a whole compendium of slaps and that she has done in different films. But there's also different um, um, kind of essentially videographic criticism of sorts, um, or early versions of that, without intending entirely to be. So I was kind of very interested in that and how that compared to other film stars. So it was that, and so it has evolved from sort of being kind of, I wonder what this person is doing, to realizing that she is this whole universe, network, and ecosystem that is actually feels never ending, um, in a kind of great way that would also makes it really hard to write a book about.
Yeah, completely. And honestly, one of the questions that I didn't include, but I kept thinking about is how did you pick what went in the book and what didn't make the book? Because I'm sure there were things you left out. I mean, that's a problem with star studies that I always run into. It's like there's just such a volume of material. I mean, I don't know if you want to answer that or if
Yeah, no, it's huge because I suppose partly if I've written about some things already, so there's
okay.
chapters and articles and that sort of thing. So some of the things I've kind of maybe worked through. So for example, all of those films where she does do the cross-dressing and all that sort of thing, I've written about elsewhere. So for example, in the Revolution Rebellion book, I have a chapter that's about Maria Felix's kind of revolutionary films of that type. And then also there's a whole kind of sex worker strand to a lot of her stories that I've also written a chapter about that. So there's kind of things that sort of thing that I've already, because I've been working on her for so long, that I've kind of worked through some of those things. But also there are other things that are difficult to kind of wrangle. So I suppose it goes back to that kind of how do you get through that noise? And some of it is really just trying to focus on, well, um, what would I like people to know, and what are the kind of the sort of, and I suppose because the framework of this as well, because I was, it's part of a series on iconography and iconic figures, I thought, well, what are the things that would kind of match up to maybe being iconic, and what's kind of the most representative elements of her, or things that have kind of people have pulled out to be iconic. So, but each chapter has so much that's also discarded. Like for example, um, the artist and things. I've only kind of taken a sampling of people, of some of the artists who made port or that she, was a benefactor of, because it just would have been impossible. It would have been just a list, rather than kind of really picking out things that kind of were indicative of what you did. So yeah, with great difficulty, I suppose is the quick answer.
Um, I'm wondering, so one of the things that I think is so rich and interesting about this book is how detailed it is. I think oftentimes, I don't know, with stars and star studies, we can get, I feel like, not to say there's surface level, but just more broad and general because there's so much to cover. But I think there's so many wonderful details here, thinking about the section on wardrobe, or also specifically like the micro gesture of the brow. Knowing that you do videographic criticism, I'm wondering if that influences the work that you do in terms of how you analyze stars, how you analyze film, if you see that as being kind of the reason why you're cued to look at more, just like specific details and elements of performance. And I'm wondering if you've made any video essays on Maria Felix.
Yeah, I've made a couple and I've published neither. But or maybe more than two actually. I think it's three actually I've made, but I've not published any of them because I've not yeah, I've not finalized them. Um, and because part of the reason I actually haven't published them is because I struggle often with the kind of, you have to explain a lot in order to get there for the person who's, because if you want to reach an audience beyond Mexico, and so it's trying to find a way in that kind of it maybe doesn't have to do that too much. So I haven't found the perfect way to do that bit yet, for a lot of the things I've done. And maybe that's my detail self is like sort of quite interested in but you just need to know this is really interesting. So for example, with the eyebrow one, I'm really interested in, and the gesture is something that I've kind of explored quite a lot. Um, and I actually have done a whole eyebrow project with a whole set of colleagues. Um, and I don't want to get too much of a tangent, but basically, just to give a little sense of what that is, we actually published something in a kind of a report on that in the journal Screen. But Liverpool, like I live in Liverpool, and Liverpool has an eyebrow named after, which is a scow's brow, which is a very thick over the brow, sort of strong, drawn in brow that was kind of very popular in the kind of mid 2010s or so, like, but it's often very working class, but it's part of a sort of performative level of appearance that is really important in Liverpool, and I felt like that resonated with Maria Felix because she's, as you can see from the like that picture of her with the cigarillo and all the jewelry, she wasn't about kind of, going, I've got this one beautiful piece and let me show it to you. Look at all my jewels. I've got all the things and they're worth thousands. But they don't even necessarily look like they're worth thousands, hundreds of thousands even. They just look like costume jewelry nearly on her, but she just is going like, I love them. Now she can also pare back and kind of look kind of more sort of whatever less, but it's similar to the kind of over the top look in Liverpool as well. It's sort of like, look how much money I've spent on myself. I don't look natural. I look like I've spent money. That's what you need to know. So the same with the brow. So I was kind of really interested in that. So I kind of through video. So to get back to the videographic criticism, I sort of thought, well, this is a whole thing because her brow is often the way, like she does I can't arch my brow, which is just, I wish I could, but she does an eyebrow arch that is kind of iconic. It's the thing, that they can almost just do an eyebrow arch and it's Marie Felix. Um, but she, so it's a very kind of, as a micro gesture, still a little bit over the top. Um, but I was trying to find, I was thinking, well, this appears a lot. So I picked out a film and I thought, this appears a lot. And then I looked through it and actually it doesn't appear as much as you want. So you could suddenly kind of pin down and go, actually, it's just the hint of it, or they kind of suggestion it's going to happen. And it almost you see the moments where it's kind of she teases that it's going to, like there's these, or the cinematographer, zooms in and kind of goes, well, I won't I? So it does really help sort of. So isolating that really made me kind of think, oh, actually, it's not as kind of camped up as I thought. It's more that it's about something different. So it does actually let you arrive at something different. It also made me realize as well, kind of in terms of editing, Mexican films were often the ones she starred in, they were made very quickly, maybe a 3 week shoot. The kind of mark for the last film was there for the next film. There's kind of a lot of, so there's a lot of quick editing, which kind of allows for in between mistakes or whatever. So it's actually, she moves around an awful lot. And that's very interesting. And that's very interesting to try and actually isolate as well if you're trying to make using videographic criticism as well, it's kind of realizing actually where do these edits happen, because it forces you to slow down or slow her down, so and to kind of really hone in on detail. And I discovered a lot about hats as a result. Not that I wrote about it yet, but there's a lot of really interesting things about hats that are there to be written about.
Yeah, absolutely. I also, just as a quick follow-up, I tend to wonder with the brow if it's not necessarily even showing as much in the films, but more in like the popular press and like photographs of her or images. I mean, I know the contemporary example of like her Barbie, like the Barbie has like the arch on it.
Mm.
Thinking about how it got established. If it's not showing up in the films, perhaps it's in other materials, do you think?
I think both, and kind of but when you look out for it, it does seem to appear in. I think it's almost in every film. I think she does it as a little kind of nod to the fans or something.
Mhm.
Um, so, but when it happens, it isn't always in the same. Um, it doesn't always mean the same thing. So it's not always just like shock or something. It can be like it can be knowing. It can be there's all sorts of things. So sometimes you really do feel like it's a very much yeah. It does appear in most films, if not all films, but maybe just once. But it
Mhm.
feels like such a thing. It's like a moment or something, and
Mhm.
a usually very brief moment.
It's something we're waiting for, right? Like the
Yeah,
expectation
like an
of
Easter
it's
egg or
going to
something.
happen at some
Yeah,
point.
yeah.
Absolutely. Um, well, knowing that this is for the Performance and Stardom SIG, I'm wondering if you could tell us what you see as the big takeaways from Maria Felix as a case study for people studying stars more broadly. What kinds of things are specific to Mexico, and what sort of concepts or approaches do you think that your book sort of offers to the broader field of star studies?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's writing about a star who's very Mexican and but also who's gonna, she would be known around very well known in Latin America and also kind of among Latinx folk in the US as well. So I think writing about her adds something to kind of the sum of kind of that conversation or that dialogue, and there's not enough written in stars and of those sorts. But actually, I think also I think there's great potential in looking at stars beyond the kind of publicity end of things. So beyond the sort of just looking at okay, they've some um so beyond kind of the maybe the official end of things in and looking at kind of what other elements of their legacy is there to be taken up. So in part things like the kind of digital kind of trace of them, but also even like what does their stuff tell you about them? Like she was one of the first to kind of adopt the Architectural Digest. She brought them. That's kind of a big thing at the moment. A lot of stars and digital influencers and whatnot. They have the Architectural Digest sort of, guide around. This is my house, sort of thing. But what does actually that stuff and the way the person might guide you through their stuff? What are they saying about them and their persona that maybe they don't know that they're necessarily even telling you? Like there's things they're deliberately trying to say is like this is the kind of curated life I have, but actually, what other kind of approaches are there? And I think also the kind of again back to the kind of eyebrow thing is that I think there's not enough written about eyebrows and micro gestures in general, um, and I'm really keen to read more about what other actors do, um, because it can be used, like hers were often melodramatic performances, but also mixed with realism and in this really interesting way. So it's kind of, she uses low key and then also kind of the low key element was often actually the eyebrow movements and the eye movements, and the more melodramatic elements were actually the way she occupied space quite in quite a significant way for a female star at the time. So, are there other stars who are doing that in that contrasting way, or how do they mix that? Um, so I'd be interested sort of if there are comparative cases or there's kind of similar cases, and also how do other stars act as co-creators or as curators of other creative lives? So like what are they, who else are they engaging with around them? Because I haven't read much of that sort of, because you see people within the industry as opposed to the creative milieu in which they inhabited. Because again, Mexico at that time was because it took in a lot of people seeking asylum, who were from, escaping World War II, escaping Franco's Spain, escaping kind of leaving Lebanon. There's a lot of different kind of people who were leaving and sought asylum and took exile and went into exile and had this amazing contribution. So also, what can we learn from that kind of interesting kind of coalescence of people, and how did other stars act? Because they don't live necessarily in Hollywood or in this kind of siloed space. They live amongst other creatives often because they kind of live those interesting lives. Um, and how do stars act as kind of muse or agent, or how are they seen as muse and how do they act as agents of their own lives, sort of thing, and other people's maybe as well.
Yeah. I particularly was moved by the way you kept positioning her as agent and kept justifying it, because I think she so frequently has been called a muse of many people, and that's how she's often known. And I think that's one of the major achievements of the book of really establishing her as agent. So, um, okay, last question for you. So you had mentioned it earlier, but it is something I had also picked up on that this book is part of the Icons of the Luso-Hispanic World series. And all of the previous books have been writers or public intellectuals from Latin America, slash Spain. Sorry, Latin America slash Spain. And I'm wondering if you could sort of reflect upon the place of like film and media stars in the field of Luso-Hispanic studies, and just sort of the place of popular culture and studying stars. I can't help but notice this is your fourth monograph, and this wasn't your first monograph. And was that on purpose? Is this a project you sort of waited to pursue because of that?
Yeah, so yeah, it's complicated because it feels like a conversation that it's surprising we're still having, kind of thing, but we still are having it. And these sorts of questions seem still, they're still often trivialized just as in kind of like, isn't it interesting you're looking at this kind of fluffy sort of area or something like that, as if it's kind of unimportant. Um, but I'm Yeah, it's, I suppose, yeah, I think it is really interesting that there isn't enough written yet, and there is not enough engagement. And I think, and this is not just specific to Mexican studies; it is more broadly in the Lusophone and Hispanic world, that there isn't enough written because they are not seen as kind of as valued and kind of important. And I think maybe this is also something that we still have to do, a bit of work of kind of convincing others, especially kind of figures who are outside of the Anglophone world, but even probably still within the Anglophone world. If somebody doesn't know them, then they don't think they're important, as opposed to kind of the enterprise of studying kind of key figures in an area isn't also as important as studying a director or as studying a writer, as those sort of things. So I think it is still something. It's a conversation we still need to have continuously. And I suppose maybe people who are more established can have those kind of more strongly or something like that, more with more confidence, because yes, it is really important that these younger people or these people who are up and coming that are doing these things. I think in some ways This is a book I've been trying to convince people to publish for years. Like, at least it's a star, at least, that I've wanted to write a book about for many years. But publishers have been kind of quite reticent, in part because she's not that well known in the Anglophone world. Um, she chose never to do accented, at least um, English language accented roles, because she did act in other languages. Um, and And I think because stars still are seen as something kind of interesting and light, and isn't it lovely and fun to do it? But actually, we won't, we won't take this seriously. Like, I had one accepted for the BFI Stars series when it first started, and then that series stopped because BFI decided it wasn't lucrative enough as a series. It wasn't worth their while. But I think they've returned to that series again,
Mm.
but they stopped that series. So and that was really unfortunate because there were some really great books out of that, and it really established and started something really exciting. So I think there's a kind of publishing problem. There's a an academic problem. There's that I don't know how we're still having this conversation that popular culture matters, but we seem to be. Um, so and I suppose it brings me back to kind of I was thinking the other day quite a lot of this is back to videographic criticism, and I was thinking about Laura Mulvey did that video essay on Marilyn Monroe that was very interesting and she wrote about how we learn how to move and speak and think, move and be embody ourselves through watching other people on screen do that. So this is like our bodies are determined by what we see on screen, and yet sort of it's seen to be something quite unimportant and trivial, and how we relate to that or how we react and respond to that. And similarly, Maria Felix kind of moved and spoke and acted in certain ways in the world that then was sort of had ripples. And her style of performance, her eyebrow thing, did influence other people's like decision to the eyebrow thing or not, and that sort of thing. So, um, yeah, so I think unfortunately, yeah, we're still kind of banging on that door, but it's not quite there. And I think also maybe I'd go back to kind of um, something I suppose I didn't mention in the last question was I think what's also interesting is and important to note is that Maria Felix is a complicated um, and I say this complicated and also she had some very troubling attitudes. So like I don't want to kind of gloss over any of those sort of things either. So I think that's also sometimes people shy away from people who didn't have a smooth life of things. And I think it's to confront and embrace and kind of challenge those and see what they're about. Um, and those sorts of figures are really important as well. If they're very key figures, well, what are they doing and what influence does that mean and what does it mean to study um, difficult figures as well? I think is something that we need to kind of challenge ourselves to do as well.
Thank you. I think we can open it now to questions from the audience if people want to ask, or I'm happy to read things out of the chat as well.
Let's see. I've got Niamh, I have a question.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah. I was, well, I'm really looking forward to the book, and certainly everything you've done on eyebrows, I've told a lot of people about it. It's amazing. I was wondering in terms of your argument that looking at Maria Felix as agent, whether you also define that or define her as also as employer in that regard, and whether, not only an industrialist point of view, but maybe in the home front, or have you looked at that or thought of that um, way of thinking of agency? Thanks so much.
Um, I have thought about it. Hi, Donna. Good to see you. um, but I actually avoided getting into it because I think it's a really important one and I think it's a really good one to pursue. I'd be happy for somebody else to pursue that though, because um, one of her last employees, who was ran her household, he was the benefactor of her estate. Now, there was also all sorts of litigious things around whether he should have been or not, and whether she was actually maybe compos mentis just at the very end. Um, but he's also very inclined. So he runs a lot of YouTube sites and um, is the maintainer of a lot of her official legacy of sorts. That is kind of it's quite stultifying and rigid. And I think in order to get into any other points of employer nature, I think I'd have to kind of deal with him ultimately. And I think he'd be too complicated of a figure to try and navigate towards the end. And maybe it's sort of to wait till maybe he, I don't know, um, he gets to some other point in his career or something like that or whatever. But yeah, I think I'd have too complicated a job to deal with him in order to get to that. But I think that's an important question. Um, but I also I had heard all sorts of anecdotes and that sort of thing around her, as being quite generous towards her employees and all. But I kind of often distrust that as well in a Latin American context because if somebody's actually just not a horrible bully, they can be kind of somehow upheld as something that's kind of okay. But apparently she was kind of quite prone, like she actually spent a lot of her cash gambling, and actually quite liked just kind of sitting around playing poker with her employees and sort of they'd, just folk from the neighborhood sort of thing, or, or she'd go out and kind of whatever. So, so I had thought about that, but the site discounted it on that basis. Basically, it was too complicated, that kind of dynamic and relationship.
I can ask a question if others don't want to jump in here. Thank you both for this conversation. It was really fascinating. And yeah, I definitely want to check out the book to see more about this eyebrow discussion. But something, in that discussion, you talked about the difference between how we might remember a performance and what actually happens in a performance. And so I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role that memory and public memory plays both in like the scholar's work, but also in how the public and fans and general audiences respond to a star. That idea of memory and how that can sometimes be very different from reality.
Yeah, that is a really interesting one. And I think that's where maybe the videographic criticism comes in because I do find that that I misremember things a lot, or I kind of hold on to something as if it happens for longer in a film, or maybe is less more tangential, whatever. That sort of you can kind of not really grasp the the real time of it, and the as in the real time of how it happens on a film, or it's kind of how it lands in significance, as opposed to maybe cutting and breaking it down. Or you can reveal an awful lot of different things that maybe are things you don't notice. Um, so I suppose for me that's how I kind of try and isolate things, and um, you notice details. Like in one film I was looking at recently, I noticed an awful lot of use of phone calls that I hadn't really particularly noticed as such a major plot point, but actually, or even sort of part of interaction. But that suddenly, like, sort of, oh, they pick up the phone an awful lot more than I remembered, because it's a lot of shots, reverse shot, sort of phone call kind of situations, um, and focusing on people's faces as opposed to maybe the phone or something, whatever it is. So I think that's for me. But then I think that kind of getting back to the eyebrow thing, that it has become more iconic than actually the amount of times it happens on films. So again, kind of looking at that and isolating that and figuring that through and seeing actually how seldom it does happen versus and actually how kind of difficult it can be to kind of capture even those shots where it does happen. Because maybe the take wasn't as long as it felt maybe in terms of its significance in the film. Um, So I suppose it helps that way, and then you kind of go, okay, well, if the shot didn't happen that long, what else contributed to making it feel like it was longer? Like, is it the music, or is it the dialogue? Is it the build up to it? Is it the kind of the reference back to it? So that's a really kind of really interesting kind of. But yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Just kind of trying to, because I think we all do that, kind of pick up things that are sort of because the mood we're in, our distraction level, or focus level, or whatever it is, what we're kind of particularly interested in that particular day, or looking out for, the number of times you might have watched something and kind of be looking out for that particular thing or moment. Um, yeah, it's a really kind of complicated one, and I don't, um, and yeah, so it's fascinating. So that's why I find the videographic criticism to be really useful, and I find more videographic as a methodology. So just putting things in there and cutting them up and splicing them and kind of finding the thing and looking at exactly how long a thing can last, and or doing different techniques like that that can help to really isolate things or figure things through, or kind of take away the things like taking away the sound and leaving just the image, or vice versa, that sort of stuff, that kind of playing it around with in different levels. And then looking at start, sorry, back to the kind of fan stuff, is what do other people pick out and isolate and kind of find more important? And I can often find that very surprising.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about just the methodology of kind of, well, what if we isolated one element in the shot, but then also kind of the communal aspect of interpreting a star, because you are going through so many different, levels of mediation to try to get to some, essence or truth in the star. And so it really does, I think, become kind of a communal process, and maybe even an exercise in that idea of collective memory a little bit.
Yeah. And also, I suppose, how she was constructed as well in this particular case, by the fact that she did get an awful lot of portraits. Mm, Um, some of them were, just people, painted a portrait and said, "Look, isn't it lovely that I made you a portrait?" So Diego Rivera, for example, did that, and actually, did one where she was pretty much looked nude underneath this kind of very transparent gossamer sort of thing, and she was like, she did not like it. Um, and apparently, I don't know, this is she wrote in her. You kind of have to take a pinch of salt with everything she says, but apparently I don't know, she was getting decorators in, and they had a big paintbrush, and then she just painted over a Diego Rivera portrait, which is worth quite a lot of money, but she was like, whatever. um and then you compare it to other portraits of people that she commissioned and she posed for and all that sort of thing, and they do really much more interesting interior kind of things of, especially women who painted her portrait. They did much more, like, consistent with their own style, but more, yeah, more reflective of that hint at somebody who is much more darker, more interesting, more layered, more, than just a pretty body in a gossamer gown.
Thanks so much. I wonder if I could ask you if you could, because I'm very unfamiliar with her and her work, and I was wondering if you could tell me perhaps a little bit more about these maybe archetypes that you mentioned as useful to situate her. You mentioned the mujer sin alma and la doña as sort of yeah, archetypes, or perhaps concepts that help explain her stardom. So I was wondering if you could perhaps tell me a bit more about them. And also, I was wondering the extent to which you might have seen these figures or archetypes developed or carried out by other performers or stars subsequently, both either in Mexican cinema but also transnationally.
Um, I think that last bit might be more complicated and much more layered to answer right here, but I think so I'll just kind of address that maybe briefly. Because I think you can trace, because I think often there's sort of a very simplistic notion of Mexican film as being kind of um, either the submissive woman, or the kind of or some form of a sex worker, or somebody who's kind of transgressed their social sexual role sort of thing. And actually, it's less binary than that. And I think she's kind of represents something that actually, if you look at her and then you follow afterwards, a lot of the kind of archetypes are actually much more layered than actually they've given them credit for. So I think she was kind of quite interesting, but also has had much more influence, I think, more recently. So maybe that's kind of I want to maybe stop that one there because, but I think in terms of the archetypes, the first role is of La Doña is the story is of this woman who goes um, to the backlands of it's actually the novel is originally set in Venezuela. The film was shot in Mexico, looks like Mexico, everything about it is sort of it's sort of mixed coded. So some of it kind of looks a bit Argentinian, but it's kind of mostly everybody speaks Mexican accent, and everybody watching it would know that. So it's kind of this weird sort of Mexico, not Mexico. And she has this terrible sexual assault. Her intended is murdered as well. So she becomes hardened by that and becomes quite. She's often referred to as kind of quite masculine, but actually she's also everybody finds her attractive as a woman. So there's this kind of weird sort of like she's gorgeous, but somehow very kind of. And I use the word masculine, obviously not complicated as it's masculine coded or as it is understood back then. Um, but then quite feminine in her clothing as well. So this is kind of interesting kind of combination. So that's kind of her archetype then afterwards. And she's somebody then who sort of had a huge amount of land and, the kind of slightly wimpy character who comes to civilize her. So it's about a civilization versus barbarianism, and she represents barbarianism. And who comes to civilize her kind of is not really much up to it. But she kind of concedes it in the end because anyway, that's the story that requires her to. But the whole film, and this is kind of a lot of the films are those kind of, a lot of them are those sorts of melodramas, and this kind of plays out as that, is these sorts of women who a lot of power, that maybe don't have that much luck with men, or have terrible luck in that case. Um, and, but she can still get them when she wants them. But she generally doesn't want them because, why would you? Because you've got all these other things. You can just have them when you don't. And, is the kind of thing when, in a moment when, Mexican women were really kind of going, can we vote? Can we have the right to vote? Can we have a position in society? Can we kind of, all the while they were like rearing children and, being in charge of families, they had all this power. They had this domestic power, but they didn't actually have any legal power. So she was kind of showing the way of going, well, actually, this is maybe how you can actually be somebody, live your own life. So that was kind of this thing that she represented, and then she was called that the rest of her career, La Doña. Um, and but then the Mujer Sin Alma is more is also kind of part of that, but it's actually most of those characters are, and that's why maybe the femme fatale sort of tracks onto it, is that it is high femme, and it's the seductress. But she's always in charge. She's always the protagonist, or she's generally the protagonist, unlike the femme fatale, who's kind of maybe the antagonist or maybe kind of the supporting role of some sort. So it's a more kind of complicated and interesting one. And she often, again, sort of her relationships with her men are of her choosing usually. Or sometimes, she doesn't get the man she really likes, but that's fine. There'll still be another man who she'll get. That's the kind of story of the stories always is the kind of, it's okay that there'll be another guy maybe. And, this other guy, she could have do without him anyway, because if he wasn't up to her, she should go and get somebody else. So it's kind of, they're not tragic in the same way that the femme fatale are. So it's a much more interesting breaking with that. And I think that's why I think the Mujer Sin Alma is a better framework for it. And I don't know if that has resonance in other places, because I think using the femme fatale as the parameter doesn't allow for us to think about it differently. So I think that's why I used the Spanish word specifically, because it was one that she also interrogated herself as well. So I found that a kind of an interesting one to kind of interrogate with her, enter into dialogue with her own kind of sense of sort of what that could mean. So I think I think these kind of archetypes, it's good to kind of not just take the femme fatale and break it, but actually find another way to frame it that actually kind of maybe acted in parallel, because it also allows for thinking through Mexican film as not kind of having a parallel, not having kind of the same track as Hollywood, but doing it somehow in a different country. It actually had kind of a different navigation of similar kind of things that were kind of going around the ether at the same time, but actually they interrogated them differently, they were addressing them differently, and also because, the cultures and laws and situations were different.
Yeah, we have time for one last question, Jose.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful conversation. I was really curious about that chapter on, the benefactor and the artwork and the jewelry and all these things. Seems really fascinating, and also, but also I'm very curious to maybe know a bit more of how you went about doing that research for that particular chapter. I know you mentioned, going through Christie's and all these things, but yeah, maybe if you can tell us a bit more about yeah, either your methods or the archives, or sort of like what went into your process for the research for that particular chapter, which seems a bit different, right, from the other ones, or poses different challenges, perhaps. I don't know, but I'm very curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely posed an awful lot of challenges because it's touching on an awful lot of kind of different disciplines, that I can't claim to have full knowledge of at all. Um, but like my dad was a cabinet maker, so I kind of have some knowledge of some of the kind of the cabinetry, the sort of the furnishings and all that sort of thing that she collected, and their kind of their real value, as well as the fact that they had erratic value because she bought them, so therefore somebody might want to own them and stuff like that. But it's kind of tracing your way through those, and Christie's is actually really useful because it maintains its archive. And you can go back and look at them, and also you can filter your kind of searches and things like that. So you can see that, she collected vases, or, you can only look at those, and you can only look at the images, photos, or you can only look at the collected um, paintings and that sort of thing. So some of it was kind of delving deep into kind of the art history around the some of the key figures um, that she collected, or she was benefactor to, and engaging with those and looking at that and seeing their significance and trying to kind of look at what the meaning of those were. So yeah, using Christie's as an amazing archive. Not an exhaustive one either, because there's certain things it didn't have full rights to. So it can't leave up all of the things that it doesn't have image rights to, which is quite interesting. But being able to at least kind of trace that was really useful. And also even looking at, because that's why I left up on the PowerPoint, was their predicted value versus what they actually sold for. Because um, I listened to an interview with the one of the curators, the auctioneer kind of for Christie's. She was like, oh, and she was Mexican, and she was like, oh, I think there'll be interest, but we're not really sure. So they undervalued everything. Um, but partly as well because some of these artists were people that were only just when Christie's were selling them off her estate were becoming big. So she was seeing people. So kind of even able to trace the money was quite an interesting one. That sort of they were definitely not big in their lifetime. A lot of them died in pecunias, and then later, even Christie's at the point of sale wasn't even convinced of their value. Whatever money might mean in art worlds anyway, but it kind of gives you a sense of at least how they're valued as artists. So that sort of thing, but also then talking to, um, there was an exhibition of her jewelry in the American Anthropology Museum, History Museum in New York. I can't remember exactly the full title of it. Um, it was something like Gems and Gemstones or something like that. So I interviewed the curator of that, and she was like, "Oh my God, I'm so excited writing about Maria Felix and Cartier." She's like, she made history, and I was like, "Did she?" Like, because I just thought it was interesting. Like my editor actually said, "Oh, did you know this is happening?" I was like, "Oh yeah." So I suppose I'll talk to her, and then she says like, so she introduced me, and she was like, "Oh, have you read all the books?" And I was like, "What books?" And she was like, "The Cartier books," and there's like a whole series of, and they weigh a lot. Like there's some of them like you're really serious heavy lifting. These are full color, beautiful books, and they're paid for by Cartier to tell the history of Cartier. So of course they're from that perspective. So there's kind of looking at So it's a quite a it was quite a task. It sort of to bring all that stuff together was quite a complicated thing, and to interrogate the idea of kind of muse versus agent and all that sort of kind of idea, or that sort of sense of kind of her agency within all this. It was it was the hardest to write because it was a lot of wrangling of different things. So I know so much more about Cartier than is can be included in that than I thought I'd ever need to know. Um, and um, and then also of kind of the tracing the kind of so I think he's using all these different elements that you don't expect would be normal conventional archives. And I think partly actually because a lot of those chapters um a lot of that chapter was written under lockdown, so I could only do through that, but also meant people were more available to me. Like, so that woman who was the curator was available to talk because the exhibition was cancelled, and otherwise she would have been super busy with the exhibition. Whereas she was like sitting around at home going, yeah, I'm good to talk whenever, forever long you need me to. So, there was kind of a little bit of the circumstance that also supported the research. Um, but really talking to people was really very useful because they gave me insights that I've never known about because I'm not a jewelry historian. Whereas jewelry historian told me like how important she was.
That's great. This is all so fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing about your process and what you learned about Maria Felix. I hope everyone will check out the book. Um, is that QR code in the I don't think it's in the promotional images, but people can definitely see the QR code on the recording once it's posted. Um, Out in paperback soon. And we hope you'll look out for other talks in the spring with the Performance and Stardom SIG. If you're not a member, check that box and join. Again, thank you so much. Some applause to both of you for this excellent conversation.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Have a
Thank
good
you. Bye bye.
Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thanks so much.